If you're considering an electric vehicle, one of the biggest questions on your mind is probably the cost of charging compared to filling up with petrol. At first glance, it seems like a no-brainer. Electric cars are cheaper to run, right? But the reality is a bit more complicated. The common assumption is that EV charging is universally cheaper, but that's not always the case. The truth is, a direct comparison between EV charging and petrol isn't straightforward. For one, there are many different ways to charge an electric car, and the cost can vary greatly depending on the method you use. Your electricity rate at home plays a huge role, and public charging stations can have vastly different prices. Charging at home is usually the cheapest option, but it depends on your electricity rate. If you're on a high-rate plan, it might not be as cheap as you think. Public fast chargers, on the other hand, can be quite pricey. Then there are free chargers, which are obviously a bonus, but they're not always easy to find. Petrol cars, on the other hand, have a more straightforward cost. You fill up at the pump, and you know exactly what you're paying. Let's break it down with some examples. Say you drive an electric car that uses about 15 kWh of electricity per 100 kilometers. If you're charging at home with an electricity rate of 20 cents per kilowatt, your cost per kilometer is roughly 3 cents. Compare that to a petrol car that gets 10 kilometers per liter, with petrol costing $1.50 per liter. That's 15 cents per kilometer. But here's the thing. If you're using a public fast charger, your cost per kWh can jump to 50 cents or more. Suddenly, your 3 cents per kilometer just went up to 7.5 cents. That's getting closer to the cost of petrol. And if you're driving a really efficient petrol car, or one that's running on a cheaper fuel type, the comparison gets even more muddled. The real cost comparison between EV charging and petrol isn't a simple one. There are scenarios where EV charging might be surprisingly expensive, and scenarios where petrol is surprisingly competitive. The bottom line is there's no single answer to the question of which is cheaper. The real cost depends heavily on your individual charging habits and access to different charging options. Once you go past the simple cents per kilometer math, the comparison becomes less about theory and more about how you actually live and drive. At 45 minutes into this breakdown, the picture is clearer. Electric cars are usually cheaper to run, but only under the right conditions. Start with charging behavior. If you charge at home overnight on a standard or off-peak electricity rate, that's typically the cheapest possible way to power a car. Using your earlier example of 15 kilowatt per 100 km at 20 cents per kilowatt, that's $3 per $100 kilometers. If you drive 15,000 kilometers per year, you're spending about $450 annually on electricity. Compare that to a petrol car doing 10 kilometers per liter. You'd need 1/500 liters per year, costing $20,250. That's a $1,800 difference every year just in energy. Now change one variable. Instead of home charging, imagine relying heavily on public fast chargers at 50 cents per kilowatt, and that same 15 kilowatt per 100 kilometer now costs $7.50 per 100 kilometer. Over 15,000 kilometers, that's $1,125 per year. Still cheaper than petrol in this scenario, but the savings are almost cut in half. Increase consumption to 20 kilowatt per 100 km in a larger EV and you're at $10 per 100 kilometers, or $1,500 per year. Now the difference versus petrol narrows significantly. Efficiency matters on both sides. A highly efficient hybrid petrol car doing 20 km per liter at $1.50 per liter costs 7.5 cents per kilometer. That's $25 per year at 15,000 kilometers. Very similar to the EV using public fast charging. Suddenly, the EVs are always way cheaper assumption doesn't hold universally. Maintenance shifts the equation again. Electric vehicles don't require oil changes, timing belts, spark plugs, exhaust repairs, or many of the routine engine services petrol cars need. Over 5 years, a petrol car might cost thousands more in maintenance. EVs still need tires, brakes, suspension components, and cabin filters, but the drivetrain is simpler. That difference often widens the total savings beyond just energy costs. Time also has value. Filling a petrol car takes minutes. Fast charging takes 20-45 minutes, and slower charging takes hours. If you mostly charge at home while sleeping, that time cost is irrelevant. If you frequently depend on fast chargers during long trips, the extra time becomes a practical cost. Even if it's not directly financial, electricity pricing structure adds another layer. Some regions have time-of-use rates where overnight charging is dramatically cheaper. Others have high flat rates that make EV charging less attractive. If you have rooftop solar, your marginal cost per kWh can drop close to zero after installation costs are recovered, making EV driving extremely cheap per kilometer. Petrol has no equivalent way to self-generate fuel at home. Upfront purchase price must also be considered. EVs often cost more initially. Even if you save $2,500 per year in energy and maintenance, it may take several years to offset a higher purchase price. Depreciation patterns are evolving as battery technology improves, but both petrol and electric vehicles lose value over time. So the true cost comparison is not just fuel versus electricity, it's energy source, charging habits, vehicle efficiency, annual mileage, maintenance time, and purchase price combined. In most real-world home charging scenarios, electric cars are substantially cheaper to run per kilometer. In heavy, fast-charging scenarios with efficient petrol alternatives, the gap becomes smaller. In rare cases with high electricity costs and low petrol prices, the difference can be surprisingly tight. There isn't a universal winner. The real answer depends on how and where you drive, how you charge, and what vehicle you choose.